Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I run the Journalism Fellowship Programme here, and I also convene the Global Journalism Seminar Series that usually runs on a Wednesday and looks at the challenges facing the media industry around the world. As part of that seminar series, we've long looked at issues of diversity, as a lot of the problems and indeed a lot of the solutions journalism needs are embedded in that topic. This month in the UK, the issue of racism in the media industry completely blew up after Prince Harry openly accused some of the newspapers here and some of the other media of being racist, generally and specifically towards his wife, Meghan Markle. A lot of journalists and a lot of editors felt very strongly about this, and I felt it's worth delving into this issue more, especially as this is a topic that has been covered around the world at the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and elsewhere, and issues around how Indigenous people, how different communities are treated by the media. On Friday, I spoke to Shazia Majid, a Norwegian journalist, who spoke about grappling with her identity in the newsroom. And today, I wanted to look at the newsroom itself. The Reuters Institute has carried out its own research on diversity in the news in different ways. Rasmus Nielsen, Craig Robertson, and I have gathered data on leadership and race and gender in the leading media organizations worldwide. And Federica Cherubini, head of our leadership programs, has interviewed news managers and editors about the challenges they face. And again, this topic of diversity has come up frequently in her conversations. And so today I've borrowed Federica and her expertise to look into this from a slightly different perspective, from the perspective of news managers, and also to look a little bit at our data. Federica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Meera. It's great to be here.
Would you like to tell us a little bit of what you found in your work, and then we'll have a discussion about where we see this going. And in the meantime, if anybody has questions or comments, do please type them in the Q&A box and I'll weave them into the conversation.
Of course. So in September, October last year, we ran a survey across newsroom leaders in 38 countries around the world. And we produced a report called Changing Newsrooms, where we looked at 3 different topics: how newsrooms were adapting to the remote working brought in by the pandemic, how they were feeling they were doing in terms of diversity, and how they were thinking about nurturing staff and talent. And specifically on the diversity point, we asked them 3 main things. One was how they felt they were doing, the organizations were doing in terms of progress in different areas of diversity. And data there is quite interesting. 80% of the people in the survey said that they felt the organization was doing a good job with gender diversity, and then dropping to 45% with political diversity, dropping again to ethnic diversity, and dropping again to 40% feeling they were doing a good job in terms of less advantaged backgrounds in their organizations. And we asked them what they thought was going to be the biggest priority to address in the year ahead. And diversity came up as the most important priority for 42% of the people who participated in the survey. Which of course is also to be framed into the political and civic society context around the world, where the conversation around race, social inequality was really coming to the front of many debates, especially in the US, but rippling across other areas, as you've just mentioned, arriving in the UK. Well, not arriving, it's not a new conversation, but getting more prominence. We also asked the respondents to tell us how they felt they were doing at different levels of the organization in terms of diversity. And that's probably interesting then to compare what they said, how they felt they were doing with the data that you have in the 2 fact sheets you just published. But the majority, so 84%, felt that their organization were doing a good job in terms of improving diversity at the junior level, less so at the mid-level, and significantly less so, so only 37% said they were doing a good job in terms of a senior level of the organization. The third area we asked them about in terms of diversity was, what are you actually doing about it, aside from how you feel you're doing, or what are you doing? And so what kind of initiatives you are carrying out? And so we asked them how many newsrooms were gathering data in terms of staff diversity, and that is quite prominent in many organizations. So 64% said that they're gathering data in terms of staff diversity, a bit less in terms of data on newsroom leadership diversity, so only 53%. 46% of people in the survey said they have someone in charge of diversity and inclusion practices. 41% said the organization track contributors. So both in terms of, so we asked them both in terms of newsroom composition, but also how they are tracking their content in terms of performance, in terms of diversity. Interestingly, only 36% said they have a budget to do something about diversity, which again is to put in the context. We know how much also the pandemic has been as taken a hit on many newsrooms and how many competing priorities, yet only 36% said they have a budget. And astonishingly, 22% said they do none of those above initiatives. So clearly a picture where there is a lot to do more, but I found quite interesting that the first step to address this topic is gathering data, is being able to measure how we progress. So maybe that's particularly interesting in contrast somehow with your findings from your report. You're still on mute.
I think it's interesting that your study says it's fairly, that a lot of managers fairly satisfied with where they are on gender diversity, because our fact sheet on women and then, at the top of news organizations shows that only 22% of the 180 top editors across 240 brands covered are women, despite the fact that on average 40% of journalists in the 12 market are women. So there are plenty of journalists who are women, but they're not reaching the top. So there is diversity, but it's not changing the power structure of these organizations nearly far enough. But let me go back to that breakdown. It was really interesting where you said basically in order they were, people were relatively happy about gender diversity, and then less, and then it kind of, in decreasing order of satisfaction, political, ethnic diversity, and then socioeconomic diversity. Political is interesting. What do they mean that? Do they mean the political views that are held by their staff?
We didn't ask them in details about that, but yes, generally is how many different views are portrayed in terms of either leaning one way or the other in the political spectrum, and so I think that's quite interesting that some might say that shouldn't be at all a criteria that is factored in terms of diversity. Because journalists shouldn't have, or of course they have a political view, but shouldn't bring the political view into content, into the work. But yes, political was diversity was just 45% of they felt they were doing a good job, and then maybe it's also because many of newsroom and the news industry culture is quite homogenous. If you take out the extremes of brands with clearly political alignment and political affiliation.
You talked about the fact that most people said it was an important issue for them. Why is it important beyond a sense of it looks good, it's the right thing to do? Did you get a sense that there's an editorial argument or a business argument for looking at the diversity in newsrooms? And what impact do you think it has on output?
Well, I think it's crucial on all of the aspects that you just mentioned. From a content perspective, if we hope that the content that newsrooms produce are to be recognized as bringing a perspective in which the audience can identify and can see themselves represented, the more views are included and the more the content reflects the audience that you're trying to serve, the better this connection, this relationship with your audience will develop. So in terms of how, whoever is in charge makes this decision every day in terms of what content, what kind of people to interview, what perspective. And in many cases are like an unconscious bias. Sometimes it's open bias, but sometimes unconscious bias. And just having a variety of people to contribute to this process just opens up in terms of diversity. Is absolutely also, I think, a business imperative. More and more, I think, especially when, that sort of like active relationship and the loyalty relationship that newsrooms are trying to build with their audience to make sure that they have a loyal following of readers day after day, and in many cases then turning to them, to the reader, for contributions, membership, subscription, making sure that their content resonates with your audience is crucial. I think one of the example in here in this is what the Financial Times has been doing for a few years now. Quite conscious about, they run some internal research and studies, and I found out a few years ago that the female readership was not as prominent and high as the male readership, and to try to address that, they started doing some different projects and initiative to address this. They developed, for example, 2 bots. One is called She Said, He Said, and tracks diversity of sources across the content. And another one is called the Jane bot. And so, unless they changed name recently, but when they launched in 2018, those were the names, and they track the number of women featured images in the homepage. So again, this is diversity is not just something that is, nice to have because it's good and it looks good. It's, I think, pivotal to the successful relationship you can have with your audience.
I mean, you speak to newsroom leaders quite a lot in the course of your work, and even outside the study you've just spoken about. Did you get a sense that people really see a connection between the diversity in their newsrooms and the output? Because again, going back to our fact sheet, especially the one on race and leadership in the news, it's very striking that the share of internet news users who say that they read news from at least one major outlet with a top white editor in Brazil, Germany, and the UK is 0. So, no people are like reading no news that is edited at the highest levels by someone who's non-white. I mean, this is incredible. And I wonder if there's an awareness of this in the industry.
I think awareness varies across countries, across cultures. Of course, I believe it's also related to where your culture or your countries is in terms of reckoning as a civil society, regardless of specific newsrooms, on how much this is an issue, and how urgent it is as an issue to tackle. With some countries, again, the United States, the UK now, the conversation now, it's front and center, is you feel the urgency, because there is also, I think, a part of public and newsroom that is voicing their concerns and saying, enough, we need to address this, which is probably in some cases and in some countries less developed, as less arrived at this, the awareness. Indeed, many of the conversation I have with newsroom leaders, it varies on where they're based and how urgent they feel around them it is. There are some organizations that have tackled this from a more like systemic way. One of the most cited projects is the 50-50 project by BBC, which is a bottom-up project. So, those initiatives don't only come from top leadership, sometimes often come by being pushed up by the bottom, by the people working there. And the 50-50 project aims at having parity of gender in representation of sources and content in their content, exactly. And now it's spread across 70 organizations in 20 countries. So they're really working with other organizations to make the project more widely adopted.
But the 50-50 is a really good example of what can be done, but it's also a project that does cost money and it costs time, and the BBC has been willing to commit to that. But as you said, in the last year with the pandemic, media organizations are under tremendous pressure, huge pressure. Do you get any sense that, there wasn't much for budget before for diversity matters? Do you think there will be much increase or any change in what time and money is allocated to addressing these issues?
I think I've seen positively, like when you see how much the external pressure is mounting on some of these issues. So for example, again, in the US is maybe one of the biggest example, where the newsroom, the people working there and the public are pushing to really make this a part of the conversation. So the New York Times has just last month in February released a report where they looked at diversity and inclusion in the newsroom, many newsrooms release public data in terms of the makeup of the newsroom. Interestingly, the New York Times really did interviews and analysis, and the name of the report is Building a Culture That Works for All of Us. So it's not just, I think, of course, having initiatives, having budget to address these things. Tracking data is the first step to kind of measure objectively how we're doing and how we're progressing. But it's really about having a meaningful conversation about, okay, then what are we doing? How are we changing the culture? Because of course, even if it's a step towards the right direction, increasing the number of people, diverse people in your newsroom, then is also about what kind of space these people have and how much really what is changing is the view that is represented, is the feeling of how things are done, not simply like a box ticking exercise.
I mean, I wonder if this is generational, and Lucy Kung, who is a senior research fellow with the Reuters Institute, has a book, Hearts and Minds, which looks at this issue as well. And she says very clearly there's kind of a difference between the managers and the staff in terms of their attitudes and where they see their identity and their beliefs and where that sits in their workplace. And this is true in the media, but in all industries, I think. And again, do you think this means that there will be a change as there's a generation of journalists coming up the ranks who are more used to both bringing their identity to the table, but wanting these discussions to be had more openly and questioning the status quo?
Yeah, I mean, I think from Lucy King's research, what is really interesting that emerge is how the new generation really makes choices based on different criteria than before, and working for a place that reflects their views of the word, the values, the ways they want to be perceived, how they feel the word should look like, has now been much more prominent than before. And so, yes, of course, like that, I think that's also a push that is coming from the newsroom that is louder. And, you know, newsrooms editors and newsroom leadership will need to decide how this clashes or not with how they perceive their organization, their values, you know, some old school approaches where there is an impartiality to be held. And so what will be the impact on a new generation bringing in strong views and opinions on the word will be interesting to see how it plays out.
I mean, Shazia talked about this on Friday, and she said the idea that you have to be objective and stand aside from the news. And her argument was no real such thing as objectivity. What you're taking is your perspective, and what becomes the norm is the perspective of the majority. Do you think that's fair? What do you think of that? Not quite your research, I was wondering.
No, not specifically my research, but I also think, you know, all of us bring a perspective on everything because of the way, you know, how a life looked like, the experience we had, the opportunities we had, where we grew up, the values. Like, so thinking that, you know, one thing is there is no such thing as objectivity in itself. The other is, you know, many argue for, as long as these views are openly admitted and kept in a way that doesn't become prejudicial in terms of what kind of things you cover, and, you know, if it is explicited that this is the view of the word, I can understand why there might be more appealing in terms of transparency, you know.
Because I wonder if there's, you know,
transparency is the new objectivity.
I wonder what I'd be interested to know what, you know, the difference between objectivity and groupthink, where, you know, there becomes one perspective that's acceptable and that just becomes.
And I think that's the other problem, right? So it's not just about, of course, it starts with having more senior leadership that's diverse, but then what also came out from the conversation you were having with Shazia on Friday, then once you have someone diverse amongst your senior leadership, are you asking that person to just be conform, like to just like blend in with the view, or are you really letting this new perspective change your perspective as a news organization, as a newsroom? So it is really about, you know, inclusivity is much more than having someone at the table, but how much those views are really opened and allowed to have a say.
Yeah, I mean, it's about culture change, which I do want to ask you about, but I'm just going to jump to the questions because there's some interesting questions from Makusua Frempong. When it comes to political alignments of, she's asking, yeah, I mean, when it comes to political alignments of journalists and news organizations in particular, how can newsrooms and news organizations have more gender and ethnic diversity in their newsrooms and top level management in general? It kind of addresses your question. You can have the diversity. How many types of diversity can you have at the top? You can have someone who's diverse in terms of ethnicity or gender, but can you have someone who's ethnicity, gender, and political and socioeconomic backgrounds? Because I often think in organizations, they kind of think, well, we've got somebody who's not quite the same mold, and that's enough.
Yeah, and I think, to address that is a problem, as some of the part of the Changing Newsroom report highlighted, is also a question about pipeline. Because to arrive to get someone very senior at the top level of the newsroom, you need to develop the talent in the organization from the start. And so all of those projects and initiatives, they really try to make sure, grants and bursaries to make sure that less privileged background, people coming from less privileged background have a chance to be part of the trainee scheme. I think one of the things that's going to be very interesting as a result of the pandemic and the working from home new reality is that I hope that will mean that many newsrooms that are quite city-centric and in cities, think London, think New York, they're quite expensive to live in, will just now consider a much more open practice of working remotely, and therefore allowing people who would never be able to afford to come to London and to do a training scheme to be able to be based elsewhere or where they live and still be part of it.
I mean, that's the kind of utopian view almost of what can happen. But what could also happen is what we saw last week with Reach PLC saying it's going to close its London headquarters for several of its publications, which means there is going to be no newsroom. So there's going to be nobody working in a cluster. Everybody's going to be working remotely. And, a lot of traditional journalists who grew up in these kind of traditional newsrooms where you learn from each other, and certainly from the senior editors, would say this is the death of a certain culture. It's a certain death of, in many ways, investigative journalism, because you learn how to really push out a story by someone teaching you how to push out a story on a practical level. Again, this isn't something I know you've looked at yet, but I just do wonder what your thoughts are on what the risks are there, that you don't. On one hand, yes, absolutely, you can have certainly you can have geographic diversity and socioeconomic diversity by getting out of the expensive urban centres, but you also then lose a lot of mentoring and a lot of connections that also helps a lot of these communities.
Yeah, I think, I don't think we'll see the end of the newsroom as we know it quite just right now yet. But we'll probably have a hybrid model where some people will still be in a newsroom and others maybe will be remote, and with all the challenges that opens in terms of how do you actually organize that, which is a conversation for another day probably. But yeah, I think that will need to be compensated with really putting thoughts, resources, and practices into work, into how you address and compensate for what you're missing. And so really many more effort on training and thinking more proactively. We saw it just in the last year, how you do onboarding, how you make sure you have a budding system in the newsroom to make sure that whoever comes in is new, without being able to stop and get a coffee with people in reality, will still get that sort of onboarding and experience. And I think it's nice to see that there are many mentorship programs now that are, they've been for a few years, but I would hope that we will have even more of these programs where we think more actively and proactively what we do to help on the sidelines, if you want.
I mean, you talk about the pipeline, and that's partly related to what you've just related now. And I always find the pipeline a little bit of an excuse in some cases. If you look at Japan, for example, where again, if you look at our gender and leadership fact sheet, the Japanese statistics are appalling. There is no major news outlets in our sample with a female news editor at the top in Japan. And when I've spoken to Japanese journalists about it, they always say, well, it's about the pipeline. You know, it takes a long time to rise up the hierarchy, and therefore women often fall out at various levels on the way up. And also women have started going to journalism now, but they didn't used to before. So the people at the top tend to be men. And other news organizations will often, when you kind of call them out on the lack of leadership, lack of women at the top, will say, you know, we're working on the pipeline. Now, how do you make sure the pipeline doesn't end up with a plug on it just before the top levels?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of internal and external factors. Some, again, are society and, you know, the fact that at some point in their career, women drop out because they take care of family is still a reality in many cultures. And so it needs to be addressed, not just maybe from an industry and newsroom perspective, but more in terms of awareness across the country. The fact that we have in some countries active conversation, you know, the gender pay gap report, and the fact that in the countries like the UK, you have to make this data available. Those are all things, you know, thinking about not just your maternity leave, but your parental leave policy, and how much you build these things, you build them in how you do things, not as an afterthought. So whenever you know, is an offer is made to someone that is, you know, after a job interview, coming to a new hire, having a description of what the parental leave policy is should be a standard. Because then you leave a woman to ask, what is your maternity policy leave? Like, and so all of those things, you as an organization, you need to think about how you can remove as many obstacles as possible to create those conditions, then make sure that you can grow stuff and you can develop the pipeline. But also, as we were saying before, also thinking quite honestly about what kind of culture there is at the top. Yeah. Because sometimes, you know, diversity, it's not just about, we were saying before, it's not just about being there. It's also like, do you actually want to be there? What culture, like, do you have to face the existing culture every day? And in some cases, some people say, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm just going to leave. I'm just going to work in a different environment, in a different context. So I think this is a serious thing. And if Newsroom is serious about handling this and addressing this, it's much more than hiring, is much more the pipeline. They need to seriously think about how to do everything.
I mean, this is a crucial point. It's the attrition rate. And what we have seen over and over again is that people leave legacy news organizations, more traditional organizations, to go and set up by themselves. So because they feel that their voices aren't being heard. And then there's a conversation about, is this a good thing, or is this something that, you know, if you're a kind of senior editor at a kind of traditional organization, should you do all you can to bring these people back in, or should you support them with partnerships? I'm talking about things like Galdem, Black Ballad in the UK, which are all set up in the digital space by journalists who in many cases just felt that their careers were going to go nowhere. They were not going to be able to do the kind of work they wanted to do within existing news organizations. So they're set of very well-respected outlets that work very well in their communities. And then they've partnered with traditional organizations on their own terms. And on one hand, this is a great model. On the other hand, it sometimes seems a sex shame because you kind of pull the talented, dynamic journalists out of one newsroom and send them elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think ideally you want both, right? It's amazing to see that independent, creative editors and journalists want and set aside and set up their own organization. It just adds to the pluralism. And you know, I think what is crucial in the difference in how this is perceived is that they're set up to build a genuine community. Where the feeling of being inclusive, it's real. It's not just you know, a statement. You know, we should hope that sense of not having, you know, it's something you mentioned on Friday, how many times we see at conferences or in newsrooms, the person who is the diverse person, then he's covering the diversity topic, is invited to conference to talk about diversity. no, they should invite to be talking about whatever the beat and expertise is. And so similarly, I think when we see new organizations and new initiatives, it's great to see them, but I would wonder why not just they don't feel that they can be, they could achieve the same thing within a new organization, but why the audience wouldn't feel that they would read the same content. Why would there be a difference if you read it on Black Ballad or if you read it on an established publication? And I think, Black Ballad recently did a month takeover on Huffington Post in the UK to, really like take the topic and bring the topic to a wider audience. And so I thought that was very interesting from both perspectives, from Huffington Post and from HuffPost, and from Black Ballad to partner in that way.
Okay. And I'm just saying, like, some people are typing questions, but please do put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, and then I can kind of see them more easily. But we spend a lot of time talking, what you've talked about is the ethical case, benefits of diversity, and what you've just talked about, the second case, is in many ways the business case. And, we hate to mention McKinsey, but I will. Their kind of most recent Delivering Through Diversity report found that corporations, not just media organizations, all corporations that have more gender diversity on their executive team are more competitive and about 21% more likely to experience above average profitability. Why do you think this might be? Is it because you're kind of hiring from a wider pool of talent, or because you're then embracing a different variety of perspectives, or is there something else? Or is it indicative of an organization in a way that's innovative?
I think it's indicative of an organization, but it's also, again, some of my background is in audience strategies and audience development, audience engagement. Like, it's about your audience. Like, Rasmus Nielsen, the director of the Institute, often says that journalists exist in the context of his audience. Like, without a public, without someone that consumes the content, what's the point of journalism? We do it for their audience, and their audience is diverse. And so if you decided actively to disregard a portion of your potential public and say, actually, I don't care enough, or I don't find a way to make the diversity of views, you just basically saying, I don't want you, and I don't want your support, I don't want your money, I don't want your, I think it's a choice that you do it, the imperative, it's on the audience side, I think. You do it for the audience.
You're absolutely right. Slightly depressing question from Finland, from Jenny Kesniemi, Finnish fellow. In Finland, journalism has been a female-dominated field since the 90s, and yet still the amount of female representation across the media is still around 30%, largely because other institutions outside of journalism are male-dominated, and the pattern is very similar internationally. And this is a slightly pessimistic take, but does it matter if newsrooms strive for diversity if that doesn't translate into diversity in the reality around us?
I mean,
sorry.
Happy question. I mean, I think it matters in the sense that if you have a platform, and as media organization, as news organization, you have a platform, you talk to people, you can reach people, then you have, you're compelled, I think, to portray a different view, to portray a view that should make society better. So, of course, having more diverse newsroom won't solve the problem in itself, but I hope, and there are many other issues, right? There is an issue on like trust in news and trust in journalism. So why journalism in some countries is not really a profession that young students and young people want to get into, because it's not really perceived as something good enough, or it's not really compelling because salaries are very low. One of the things that we look at the Changing Newsroom report is also about talent and how it's more difficult, many newsroom feel, to hire non-editorial staff, also because many other areas in which these people can go work pay much more. So it's a very complex issue. But I think, again, newsrooms should want to do better, and I would hope there would be a first step to then make society better.
Do you think there's any kind of utility in a kind of collective action, the equivalent of kind of the climate change pledges, so kind of the idea that newsrooms pledge to hit certain targets, the way corporations have over gender pay, for example, or representation, female representation on boards in certain countries. There have been targets set and they've been held accountable. Do you think this would work in journalism?
I think, public commitment work in the sense that, if you think about how many newsrooms have now looking with like focusing on reader revenue, and so go to your readers and ask them to support you, and some through straightforward subscription, you pay to access content, but more and more now through membership, where the pledge is you support me not because I'm going to put the content behind a paywall. In fact, you support me for the content to be kept open for everyone to be accessible, but you support me because you recognize yourself in the values and in the views of the word, in what we stand for. That part of what we stand for diversity and inclusion, as much as in some newsroom, The Guardian was one of the first newsroom to start like not calling climate change, but thinking about what kind of words and labels they use to address issues. I think if you marry that with what we were talking about before, the younger generation are much more prone to take this issue of values and what organizations stand for as an important factor in deciding who to read and what to support. I think that might be interesting to see.
And you've taken this research around the world, and I'd just be interested to know how this plays out globally. I mean, on the fellowship program at the moment, we've got Christine Francisca from Indonesia, whose newsroom, which is Glance, which is kind of a, something that looks at news on the lock screen, an Indian outlet, and she's in the Indonesian bureau. All the editors, all the senior editors are women. You've just ended with, a lot of, and I hear there's a lot of the new digital first product have a very female-led top level tier of management. I'd just be interested to know what you found, whether this is something you've found as well.
Yeah, again, I think the cultural impact, I think it also correlates with the sense of urgency and how much this conversation are part of the general conversation in society, and therefore then are reflected in the newsroom. Some of the people we've interviewed for them, we asked to participate in Changing Newsroom survey, did say it's not perceived as urgent enough. We talk about it, but it's not, diversity is not put at the number one priority for real. Maybe sometimes it's said so, but doesn't follow actions. So I think across the world, it varies also in terms of how urgent the topic is and what external pushes around society also we see.
Well, that's the point, because with climate change, there's been external pushes, both from society, but also from investment. So several investment funds have divested their fossil fuel investments, and companies have been held to account on their green energy record. So this is kind of investors' pressure and consumer pressure has led to change. I don't see much of that in the media industry around diversity.
No, and I can think of, when I can think of something, it's more in terms of gender diversity, and less about the other issues that we mentioned. And then
the danger there is that people don't campaign for change. They just stop reading the newspaper or watching a station or listening to a particular podcast. They just switch off altogether. So you've lost them completely.
Yeah, completely.
I mean, I'm just looking at a link here. I mean, in an evolving industry, this is Caitlin Mercer, who's on this call, is posting a link about diversity and innovation in particular, because there is an idea that you can't really call yourself an innovative industry unless you are willing to address the issue of diversity, basically. You will not reach your potential. You will not unlock all the true potential you have without diverse workforce. And crucially, if you don't have that diversity, that's because inherently your processes and your systems are stuck, are kind of static and calcified. again, there's so much of journalism that we talk about a reluctance to change, a reluctance to kind of see what's coming down the line in terms of digital disruption. I do wonder if there's connection there.
I mean, we know that much of the industry, and again, we shouldn't generalize because there are differences and there are different examples and there are positive examples, but generally as an industry have not been particularly good in thinking about what's coming, what's ahead in the next 5-10 years. We are kind of a reactive industry.
Yeah.
You know, think about, we're still here in 2021 talking about how we do digital transformation. Like we still haven't, you know, or, you know, how we look at like new technologies and a lot of conversation we have about innovation. It's not really about like, you know, crazy things from the future where with robots and, you know, that is one part, but a lot of innovation is just quite old school. And so I think, with exception, of course, but I think generally across many organizations and many industries, many countries, we haven't been doing particularly well.
Yeah, I think you're right. Going to questions now from Simon Franson. What do you think are the most interesting examples of newsrooms tackling diversity at the leadership level? You mentioned the FT, which also has a kind of quite formidable editor, Rula Khalaf, at the top, but which other newsrooms do you think?
Well, I think those newsrooms are trying to tackle both the how to address diversity of content and how to address diversity of their own stuff. So again, you know, the fact that the BBC has a 50-50 project and like is so prominent in terms of content, I think you need both. You need full components. You have how we're doing in terms of content, who we're interviewing, what we're talking about, and having a newsroom that is more diverse in terms of people working in the newsroom also means that it's much more likely when you're about to send out a front page where all the single authors are male or all the photos are male, someone will say, wait a minute, isn't it missing something? Because with our own eyes, we'll pick up something that someone else will not. And so it's that kind of awareness, and then you need that sort of like content and personal like diversity. And
I think it's interesting when you look at specific newsrooms, the ones that I think that come to mind, Rappler in the Philippines, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London, both led by women and have a very different conversation with their audiences to the other media organizations in the space they work with. And I don't know if that different conversation is because they're led by women, but I certainly think, going back to the point in the chat about you know, diversity and neurodiversity is important. You come up with different strategies and you see things differently and you communicate differently, I think, if you've got kind of a proper gender balance at the top.
Yeah, and the awareness around you now, you know, in the US, there are a few top publications that are thinking about or are about or have just hired new top leadership. The pressure around like the eyes are on them to see who you're going to hire, who's going to get a role. And so kind of you've also feel the context of like the pressure from the context in knowing that you'll be observed what kind of choices you make. And so I'm sure that awareness also plays into the choices.
Right. And then a question from Anna Macera, who's been asking about this because she wants to look at this research in Italy. So Federica, you are Italian. What's your take on what's going on in the Italian media as far as diversity is concerned? There is a push from some to increase diversity in bylines on the front pages with the hashtag tutti maschi, all males, shaming those editors-in-chief who don't pay example to this. And do you think this is effective? Is there something else we should be doing?
Hi, Hannah. Tough question. Yes, I'm Italian and I'm quite vocal sometimes in you know, on Twitter or in other spaces in saying there is no excuse. We need to do more. There is no, you can't, you know, I get so mad when I see articles featuring the top innovating leaders and they're all male and conferences where they're all male. And you think like, really still? I wouldn't, you know, I would hope that shaming wouldn't be the only way forward. There are many amazing and you know, competent and smart women in many of their news organizations in Italy. And and so I think it's about how much space they get into their own organization. Sometimes it's also about, a bit more of pressure on them in not getting any opportunity where, like when they get invited to conferences and things, it's horrible to say that they should always say yes, but there is a power in, if you have a position of power where you can speak up. I think speaking up and talking more and more about we should do more, highlighting more women colleagues. I think, there is a lot that men can do, even if maybe you're not in a position where you can effectively change who's going to be the next editor-in-chief. How many times you are in a meeting and someone is talking and you are talking, can you get the chance to bring in someone else from the team and say, actually, I'm not going to speak today, my colleague is going to speak today, and feature different views. If you get invited to go to a conference, can you say, actually, I'm not coming, my colleague is coming, and get a chance to highlight the different voices. So I think there is something you can do in terms of putting pressure and being vocal and, shaming, which is not great, but sometimes effective. But there are also like smaller acts that might even go further, that we should all think about.
And a question from Batiev, and it's again looking outside Europe and America, when opening newsrooms, and if there are not enough qualified women journalists in the country where the newsroom, how do you create balanced newsrooms? I mean, I have a thought on this, which is that you make sure, you have to kind of work to get women in at the bottom, but also fast track careers in some ways, give the groups that you feel need representation at the top extra training, extra access so that they can accelerate. And, this does exist. The Foreign Office has a fast track program. You bring graduates in and you kind of push them faster to the top than they would otherwise go up. And there's no reason that can't be done for particular groups in society as well, I think.
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, there are some reason that are mentioned for why this is difficult, which might be a real reason, but sometimes it's also half of an excuse. Yeah. And so I think it doesn't matter if that's what it is. We should do better. If you are in a position of power, that's your job to try to do better.
Yeah. And I also think there's a sense that people have a very clear idea of what a leader looks like. And sometimes you just need to change that perception. So you have an image in your head, literally sometimes an image of somebody male or white or whatever, but you just have to kind of look at people differently as well and see the leadership potential in different people.
And that's also, reflects on how much new generation will think, I want to do this job, I can do that because I see someone that looks like me represented at the top. And if you don't, then that also impact on the willingness of getting into a career or choosing a path, because you don't really see anyone that looks like you in a position what you aspire to be.
Absolutely, and Shazia mentioned this as well.
Yeah,
like white minorities are not going into journalism because they don't see, they're ambitious and they want to path to the top. Very good question from Bermat here. Again, one of our fellows. There are gender roles that exist in journalism too, when certain beats or topics are traditionally assigned or ascribed to women or men. And how much, in your opinion, do such stereotypes and roles stand in the way of more diversity of content and staff in newsrooms?
I think, again, there is always like a double side on these things. Having someone who's in charge, whose job is dedicated to highlighting different policies or thinking about addressing the problem is a step forward, as long as then that issue isn't boxed into, oh, it's that person's job. It's never one person's job. It's everyone's job. I can make a parallel with the role of the public editor and news ombudsman, where at some point, and we had a fellow last term working on this, and we were discussing like how much having someone in one position also sometimes the risk is that it gives an excuse to the news organization, say, oh, but we're talking about that, we have that person, without having making everyone's responsibility to address it.
I mean, there's two things on that. Firstly, the public editor's role used to be a kind of role given to a kind of relatively senior man at the end, you know, at the end of his career. And then it became a very female role. So that a lot of the public editors became women, and it became a thing that you give to a woman and slightly marginalized the role. So it's really great to kind of see it brought back to center and say, right, let's have a proper conversation now about why we have this role and who does it. And also the other thing, Bermet, on this is health reporting. I think it's been really interesting in this last year, where health reporting, which was traditionally a kind of female sector, has suddenly become the most political, most important, the only story in town many of the times. And it'll be interesting to see if health remains a prestigious, important beat that regularly gets onto front pages, and whether it remains a female-dominated beat. So
I think in that it made me think about, when we asked the survey respondents in Newsroom, what is the biggest priority for the year I had to address, was ethnic diversity. Was it because we came out of a summer of social unrest and protest, from George Floyd killing to like where the conversation became so important around the world and in specific countries to not being able to be pushed on a side anymore? And so how much that sort of awareness of actually we've tackled the feeling that we've tackled gender, although your report clearly showed that we haven't, but that feeling that we've done some progress, it's because society has pushed us to work, to look towards that. And then there is a new push now around ethnic and how much those external forces play into that awareness.
And also how sustained they are, because you're absolutely right. And we're having these seminars because these issues hit the headlines, but then they fall out of the headlines. And it's always astonishing how fast things go back to the status quo, and how much of a push you need the next time around to get back in a way, get back some of the ground that was lost, that was gained. It gets lost and you have to keep regaining it.
Completely.
Federica, thank you so much for this. I think this has just been a really amazing conversation, and thank you all for your comments and questions on the webinar as well. All our research is on the Reuters Institute website, so do look for it there. We decided deliberately not to kind of do a presentation with slides here, because I think the data is really important, but it's also really important to have these conversations live while we can, and hopefully soon we will also be able to have them in person. And this now really is the last set of seminars till after the Easter break. So thank you all for your time and your attention, and keep tuned for the next batch. Thank you. And thanks again, Federica.
Thanks so much, Meera. Thank you. Bye-bye.